Yada, yada, yada. Like,
all right, so here we go. He just yada, yada, yada history. Only, some important stuff about history. I'll yada, yada, yada math and never use it again. Okay, so find X. Yeah, right. I hate math. All right, so here we go.
Listen, Waldo.
Ashley agrees with me. She gave me the thumbs up. I see it. She didn't show it on camera, but I saw her little arm move. Like it was a
I like how you said little arm.
All right, so here we go. We're talking about chapter 13, section 2. We were last week discussing the middle passage of slave trade, right? Where we discussed how awful that was and how a lot of lives were lost during the middle passage, right? That was the part where slaves were taken from Africa, brought over to the Americas. Also, when the slaves ended up here or in the Americas, both South and North America, how a lot of them died based on just disease, having never experienced the diseases that are over here. And so, tragically, thousands upon thousands of people lost their lives either in the voyage or just getting here, not even dealing with yet the atrocities of slavery once being enslaved. Does that make sense? All right, so we're at that point. We're in the second 2 paragraphs of that section, and I'll get started. So before Europeans became involved in the slave trade, most slaves in Africa were prisoners of war. Underline that. That's important to note. It's important to understand that. Slaves were sold at slave markets on the coasts. At first, African slave traders got their supplies of slaves from coastal areas and nearby. As the demand for slaves increased, they began to move farther inland to find their victims. So who was doing the slave trade? Who was doing it? Was it the Europeans going and kidnapping hundreds of thousands of slaves? No. All right. It was their own people, right? It's something that needs to be, addressed. It's something that needs to be understood, that when we're talking about slavery, slavery was a crime against their own people. It happens today where, if you go to third world countries and stuff like that, where people are enslaved by their own people. It looks a little different. It might not look the way we think of, say, plantation slavery, but when you hear of sex trafficking, right, that is a form of enslavement. And it happens in other countries especially. Does it happen here? Of course it does. But on a drastic scale, it happens in other countries where we see people being enslaved by their own people. Africans were set up as like clans, right? Tribes, if you will. And so if there was a war between warring tribes, what they would do is they would take the strongest of the tribe that was conquered and trade them off. All right. So again, they're not taking the weakling, the sickling, right? They're taking the biggest and the best of the people, of the population, and trading it off. Do we see how that could really cause a problem in the future? Right? Think about it, right? Me and my wife are both short. Guess what the odds are my kids are going to be short? They're pretty good, right? So now if we were both tall and muscular and in great shape, what are the odds that our children are going to be tall, muscular, and in good shape? Pretty good. All right, they could go against that. There's always those recessive genes and stuff like that. But by taking the strong and the best of the best, if you will, and selling them off into slavery, what you're doing is you're decreasing the population at a cellular level. Do you understand how awful that is? You're not just taking the people that are alive then. You're destroying that population for future generations. Do we understand that? All right, so it's a pretty harsh thing to even think about. So as the demands increased, they moved more inland. Many local rulers traded slaves. They viewed slaves as a source of income. Again, their own people, right? Africa, its own people, viewed slaves as a source of income. Many sent raiders into defenseless villages in search of victims. Some local rulers did become very concerned about the impact of slave trade, but their protests were generally ignored by Europeans and other Africans. All right, so it's not as if everybody bought into this process, okay? There were some African rulers in particular that thought, they could see how awful this was and what it was doing to their population, and they basically were pleading with the other clans, the other tribes, please stop. Like, do you understand what this is doing? It's going to destroy us for the long haul, for future generations. And when we look at Africa even today, it is nowhere near where it could have been. Right? We talked about that last week when we went over notes, or 2 weeks ago, where we went over some of these notes, where it is nowhere near where it could have been. if the population wasn't depleted, if the culture wasn't destroyed. We'll get a little bit more into the culture being destroyed as we go through some notes. The slave trade led to the depopulation of some areas, right? It also took the youngest and strongest men. This is what we just talked about. I would underline that. And women from the community. The need to provide a constant supply of slaves led to an increase in warfare. So think about this. What are some causes and effects of slavery, right? Causes are, the desire to have more money, the desire to have more cheap labor, right? The desire to conquer. All of these things were causes. Some of the massive effects of slave trade were a depopulation of people, right? A lot of people being killed off or sold off. And then more war. More war. Why? Because if I'm an African tribe, right, and I want to make money, how am I going to make my money? I'm going to sell more slaves. Well, I need more slaves. So what am I going to do? I'm going to start fighting. I'm going to start creating more war. What does war do to a place? Does it make a place look great or does it destroy a place? Hello, thank you, right? It destroys a place, right? War doesn't you don't see a war-ravaged area and go, man, that's beautiful, right? It's destroyed. Look at World War II. Look at the areas after World War II hit where the Germans went through, okay? It wasn't nice afterwards. It was destroyed. And so we see this is happening to Africa, that the places are being destroyed and more war is happening. More death is happening. All right. Of course, coastal leaders increased their raids on neighboring people. Of course, the slave trade always had a tragic effect on the lives of individuals and their families. The slave trade also had a devastating effect on some African states. Underline this. In Benin, for example, the slave trade caused the population to decline and the warfare to increase. As time went on, keep reading and underlining, the people of Benin lost their faith in their gods. Underline that. Their art deteriorated. And human sacrifice became more common. Okay, so do any of those sound like a good thing to happen in your culture? No. Any of them? No. You might not be religious, but when a culture loses a faith in God, a lot of people use their religious faith, their faith, as a means of life, like as a reason to live, correct? So if you have no reason to live, what might you care about? Probably not much. How might you treat your fellow man? Probably not too well, right? If you don't really have a desire to live or you don't really think that there's a moral compass anymore. The other thing, their art deteriorated. When we see a culture start losing its art, right? Where does art come from? Where does art come from? Anybody in here write poems? Anybody out there write poems or music or paint or do anything like that? Where does that usually come from? Your heart, your feelings. Right? Yes, absolutely. Right? It could be some sad feelings. Of course, a lot of great love songs come from heartbreak, right? A lot of great country songs, if you like country, come from, my dog left me, my wife left me, my dog died, my truck broke down. Those are all bad things, right? But they come from your heart. They come from feeling. I've never known anybody to write a song that had no feeling in the song. That would be a weird song, right? Maybe the alphabet has no feeling when you sing the alphabet. But in general, when you're writing a song or you're painting a picture, there's emotion, there's feeling involved, correct? When art begins to deteriorate, when we start to see art not happening anymore, what is that saying about the population of a people? What is happening to them? What kind of a state are they living in anymore? Bad state. Probably overwhelmingly depressed. Not many artists are necessarily working well. You ever watch those behind the music shows or how a band breaks apart, right? I love those. I always find them very interesting. These huge bands, right? Anybody ever heard of Journey, right? You probably heard of Journey. You probably heard some of their songs. Your parents probably listened to it. For some reason, they're still huge around. I always laugh that some of their songs are still the most downloaded songs in music even today. I watched over the weekend, last week, a show about how they broke up. And it's interesting that their music stopped. They stopped writing music when they became kind of at odds with one another and depressed, right? We can write songs when we have kind of a bad day, right? Or, our girlfriend or boyfriend breaks up with us. We can write a song about that. But when every day there's no reason to live, I don't see many people sitting down to what? Draw, write a song, right? Those kind of things. You let out their emotions. They kind of go inward, right? And they cut themselves off from people. Does that make sense? Go ahead. Were you raising your hand?
So, at the end
Yes.
When you say that, are you saying like sacrificing to like give them away as slaves, or
No.
actually
Killing
killing them?
them. A lot of the faiths of some of these tribes believe that if they could get their gods to be happy and they could please their gods, maybe this awfulness would stop. Okay? And so what they did is they started, they believed that if they could offer more lives up, that would appease the gods. Right? We saw this a lot in some Mexican groups over the years. Right? The Aztec. Have we heard of the Aztecs? Right? A lot of human sacrifice was big in some of those religions, or some of those societies is probably a better way to say that. They truly believed that if they offered more lives, bloodshed, that it would appease the gods, that it would make them happy. Some cultures actually offered up their children to different gods. All right, so every aspect of their culture based on slave trade was becoming destroyed, was becoming awful. All right, and it was a lot of it, not all of it, but most of it was this self-inflicted wound that if they just would have stopped, guess what would have happened? Slave trade probably would have stopped pretty quickly. And so that's really sad, right? That's really sad. And if people just were smarter and were willing to not be scumbags, they wouldn't have continued slave trade in these other areas. They would have paid for labor. They would have respected human dignity in life. All right. So, but again, we live in the year 2021 now, and we still see a lack of respect for human life and a lack of respect for human existence and what each person's value is, right? How often do we see that? I always thought that I'd live at a time period, I'm 44 now. I always thought that I would see a time period where we didn't treat one another any differently based on, the color of your skin or right? Think about that, how weird that is. Like, I don't know how you're being raised. I know I was raised that when you look and you see people are people, right? And I can't imagine being alive, especially back then, but even now that we still deal with these issues. It's mind-boggling to me, and I think it always will be. But again, I do go back to that it's even more mind-boggling that they were doing it to themselves. Like think about that. That's just, it's crazy to me. I don't know. It's so, I remember when I learned that the first time. I think a lot of times when we learn about slave trade, we just think it's these awful people going into another country and destroying that country. But when you find out that country was doing it to itself as well, it makes it even more tragic, right? At least to me it does. But that's the reality of it. So we're done that section of notes. I'm going to stop this right here.